I call the member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to move this motion in relation to the Gillard government's poor response to complaints about fraud in the home insulation program, in response to, first of all, the appallingly dismissive attitude shown by this government to individual Australians whose homes and apartments have been used to perpetrate fraud under the home insulation program, and secondly, the failure of the government to provide information to the Australian public generally about instances of fraud under the home insulation program and how cases are being investigated and prosecuted. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Rudd-Gillard government's home insulation program has been a catalogue of maladministration and mismanagement from start to finish. The government, I am sad to say, is maintaining this sorry record of inadequate performance in the way it is attempting to clean up the mess. Let me therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, outline the experiences, the unhappy experiences of a number of my constituents in this matter and the conspicuous lack of assistance which they have received from the Gillard government in response. Let me start with the case of Mr Peter Napper, who is chairperson of the body corporate of an apartment complex in Hornsby. Mr Napper received notification from the government that a claim for insulation had been made against the property. However, no authorisation of the installation of insulation had been given by the body corporate. On investigation, it became apparent that the complex had been broken into and cheap foil insulation scattered in the ceilings of a number of apartments in the complex. Significant damage was done in the course of the break-in, in the order of $3,500. Accordingly, after Mr Napper raised his concerns with me, I wrote to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy Efficiency, Greg Combet, in early October 2010, seeking assistance in getting a proper inspection of the premises and to ensure that the apparent fraud and trespass were investigated. I received a response from the Minister's Parliamentary Secretary, well known to my colleague the member for Higgins, on the 25th of November 2010, and in his response he said that 3 inspections had occurred and more were to be arranged. Subsequent inspections occurred and the foil was removed from the ceilings. As to the investigations for fraud, let me quote from the Parliamentary Secretary's letter. Quote, "The information provided by Mr Napper in relation to the way in which the insulation came to be installed at the complex has been referred to the Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency under the Program Compliance and Audit Strategy for further investigation. While the government may not advise Mr Napper of the final outcome of this referral, please be assured that the Australian government will not tolerate fraudulent conduct." Close quotes. Well, no, thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We will not be assured. We want to see the evidence, and that is why I am moving this motion today. The letter indicates that, quotes, "cases for fraud will be referred to the Australian Federal Police or other authorities for potential prosecution," close quotes. But let me repeat, outrageously, Mr Napper is told by the government that he may never be advised of the final outcome of his referral. He is told that he and his affected unit holders may never find out what happened, whether an investigation occurred, whether anybody was charged and prosecuted, whether restitution is sought. Now, none of this is occurring as you would ordinarily expect, and that is very, very unfortunate. Indeed, extraordinarily, Mr Napper has not yet been interviewed. Nobody has sought to interview him or other residents regarding this issue. The owners are left in the dark. All they are left with is an extra $800 strata levy each to pay for the damage. Let me turn to the second case concerning Mr Ray Black, who is a member of the Executive Committee of a strata complex in Turramurra. His name and signature were used by claimants who can only be assumed to be fraudulent claimants. He advises me his signature was forged, and our assumption is that it was obtained from the notice board in the complex. Mr Black reported the matter to the Department of Climate Change. He was told, in the now familiar refrain, that they may not get back to him. I have written to the Minister asking for full details of how this matter is to be investigated. I have yet to receive a response, and once again this shows a scandalous disregard for the legitimate interests of persons whose homes have been broken into and taxpayers who have been responsible for paying for this whole sorry mess. Let me turn to a third area of known problems under this program, under the home insulation program, which is phantom installations, where an installer had claimed for a non-existent house or for work not carried out. I've been assisting Dr and Mrs Nelson of Killara, no relations, I hasten to add, to my predecessor as the member for Bradfield, who received a letter from the department indicating that a claim had been made against their property when in fact no installation had occurred. I know this myself because I have personally investigated the cavity space in their attic, and although I may be a lawyer and not a qualified installer, I can tell when pink bats have been there for over 20 years. Dr and Mrs Nelson wrote to me and they said, quotes, "We would particularly like to be advised as to what the Australian government intends to do, if anything, about the recovery of all this money obtained fraudulently, and if they intend to pursue and prosecute the persons or companies involved." Well, I am very sorry to have to say to my constituents that while they may want to know that, sadly the Rudd-Gillard government doesn't want to tell them that. I wrote to the Minister on their behalf in April 2010. Response, shrieks of silence. Heard absolutely nothing. I was required to write a follow-up letter, which I did 6 months later. When did I receive a response? March 2011. Dazzling performance from the Parliamentary Secretary. And what did the response say? You guessed it. Quotes, "Even after completion, the details of investigative activities will normally remain confidential." Close quote. So once again, the sorry saga that Australian households are to be kept in the dark about whether fraud investigations involving their own home have occurred at all, and if the investigation has occurred, what the outcome is and whether restitution is being sought. Madam Deputy Speaker, the situation experienced by my constituents more than justifies the action proposed in this motion that the Parliament should condemn the Rudd-Gillard government for showing disregard for the interests of Australian householders, and this motion also requires the government to provide information to homeowners whose properties have been used to perpetrate fraud. I need hardly remind the House that fraud has been perpetrated in a myriad of ways under the home insulation program, as has been detailed in both the Hawke Review and the Auditor-General's review, including early claiming the maximum rebate irrespective of dwelling size, claiming for dwellings that do not meet the program criteria, households double-dipping between Commonwealth, state and territory programs, removing older insulation to make the customer appear eligible, use of non-compliant materials, and bats cut in half to spread them further or thrown into the roof without being laid properly. After my constituents and I failed to get satisfactory answers in the cases I have instanced, I followed up this matter, Madam Deputy Speaker, by asking the Minister a detailed question on notice, seeking information about the home insulation program, including how the government was seeking information about fraud, how many claims of fraud had been received, what were the outcomes of investigations, what prosecutions had taken place, what claims of restitution had been made, what information was being made available to homeowners who made claims of fraud. The Minister failed to answer the questions. He merely referred to his public statement that a forensic audit had taken place. This is nothing more than a whitewash. We have no detailed information. The Australian people deserve to have full answers to these questions. They deserve to know the full scale of this fraud, which, need I remind the House, they are paying for. When we hear from the government, quotes, "It will not tolerate fraudulent conduct," close quotes, let's see the proof. And let's come to the final point. There is very little information provided about the scope of the forensic audit that was conducted. And yet there is evidence that there are more issues which remain uninvestigated. Just last week, a constituent contacted me with concerns about yet another apartment complex in Hornsby, where on first investigation it appears that there is a significant problem. So therefore, based upon these instances in my own electorate, which I know are replicated in many other electorates. The Coalition believes that the government needs to be much more thorough in its investigation of the fraud which occurred in the housing installation program, and for that reason this motion also calls on the government to immediately authorise an additional 50,000 random home inspections from within allocated funds. We need to see some action from this government. It is not good enough to assure us that they won't tolerate fraud. We need to see the proof, because my constituents and many other Australians are suffering, and we need to have some assurance this is being investigated.